Bow your heads with me again, please. Gracious Father in heaven, I invite your Spirit to be here to give me the words to speak, to give us each one hearts that will respond to the message that you have for us today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You all, I'm sure, remember the story in the Bible about Jacob and how he fell in love with Rachel, and his uncle Laban made a deal with him that he could work for 7 years to earn the dowry, the bride price, to marry Rachel. But Laban did a switch at the last minute, gave him Leah instead, and then worked another deal with Jacob that for another 7 years he could marry Rachel as well. Well, Rachel had 2 sons with Jacob, Joseph and Benjamin. And because Rachel had been Jacob's favorite wife, and then she died, it turned out that Joseph and Benjamin became his favorite sons. So life was good for Joseph in childhood. It wasn't so good for his other 10 brothers, or at least that's what they thought, because they were jealous of their brother Joseph. The thing we remember most about Joseph's older brothers was the fact that they sold their brother into slavery. But the Bible tells us other stories of the crimes of Joseph's brothers, not the least of which was murder. Selling their brother into slavery was only one among many things that Joseph's brothers had done. And Joseph was his father's informer about the things that his brothers had done, at least from time to time. One day, for instance, the Bible tells us about that Joseph and his brothers were out shearing sheep in the fields, and at the end of the day, Joseph came running home to his father to tattle on his brothers. It doesn't tell us exactly what the bad report was, but it could have been something even minor. Dad, Simeon was being mean to the sheep. He tied all the tails together and left them that way, or Levi did such and such, whatever it was. We don't know what the report was, but we know instinctively the point of Genesis 37:2 when it says that Joseph brought their father a bad report. The point is that nobody likes an informer. Nobody likes a tattletale. And if you continue reading this part of the story, Joseph does sort of come off a little bit of the spoiled kid. It seems like that. For instance, Joseph had what everybody else considered to be grandiose dreams. Even his father told him to not share those kinds of dreams. But Joseph seemed to share them with whoever would listen. One dream was about how he and his family were represented by sheaves of grain, and how his sheaf stood up straight and tall, while all the other members of the family, their sheaves gathered around his and bowed down to him. Another dream, the sun and the moon and the stars represented his family, and they all gathered around him and bowed down to him. The fact, though, that Joseph had these prophetic dreams, because that's what they were, does not prove that he was a spoiled kid. It doesn't prove that. In fact, if we think it through, probably the reason that God was able to give him those kinds of dreams, those prophetic dreams, those glimpses into the future, was because Joseph was not that sort of a person. That Joseph was more a sensitive and gentle kind of person that God could actually speak to. But Joseph's brothers didn't see things that way. And that is to be expected, I guess, because it's always the case that when guilt comes into close proximity with righteousness, that the guilty, even in their own eyes, stand out in stark contrast to the righteous. And that makes them uncomfortable. And that's what happened to Joseph's brothers. Their guilt was exposed when they were around their brother Joseph, and they resented that. The Pharisees, remember, had the same problem being around Jesus. Anytime that evil gets anywhere close to light, that darkness that it exposes wants to get away. That's just the way it works. Joseph wasn't perfect, though, and his father helped to complicate the situation a little bit for him because it was clear that Joseph was his favorite son. When Joseph came home telling tales about what his brothers had done, his father didn't chastise him, didn't say, really you shouldn't be that kind of a tattletale. Maybe he responded the opposite. Maybe he said, well, thank you for telling me what Simeon did. I'll make sure that he's punished for that. Now, Joseph, come over here. I got something to show you. See this beautiful new coat I made you? Have I ever told you you're my favorite son? Well, probably he wasn't that obvious, but he didn't have to be that obvious. Brothers and sisters notice things, right? They notice things. And so they well understood that their father was playing favorites. We can't exactly criticize. We can't point fingers very well at Jacob because we do things similarly ourselves. If we have two people walk into the church lobby and one is obviously well-to-do and one is obviously a beggar, we sometimes tend to prefer one over the other. That's called favoritism, isn't it? When we give our respect to someone that is in a higher position than us, and we show disrespect to someone who maybe is in a lower position than us, that's favoritism, isn't it? It was enough of a problem that God gave us some counsel in James chapter 2 that says, don't do that. Don't play favorites that way. Well, early one morning, Joseph's father came into Joseph's tent. And he woke Joseph up and he says, I need you to go on a trip today. Your brothers have been out at Shechem herding the sheep for a long time. We've had no word back. I want you to go and make sure that everything's all right. And so Joseph got up. He found his fancy coat. He put it on. He got some food. It was more than a day's journey to Shechem, and he set off walking. He didn't find them in Shechem, and a man directed him on to Dothan. And in the distance, his brothers saw him coming. You couldn't miss the coat. Here comes our brother. Hey, Gad. Hey, Judah. Look what's coming. It's the dreamer, the fool. Hey, guys. Daddy isn't here. He can't run to him today. And the brothers all look at each other. Here is our chance to teach our little brother a lesson. What do you have in mind? Let's kill him. We can throw him into one of these pits, dip his robe in blood, tell our dad that a wild animal killed him. We won't ever have to listen to the dream again. And the brothers agreed to do this. And then Reuben comes. He hadn't been there. What are you looking? Oh, I see what you're looking at. Here comes our little rule over you brother. And the brothers fill Reuben in on their plan. Now, Reuben hates Joseph as well, but killing him was a little much for him to stomach. And so he says, why don't we not kill him? Why don't we just throw him into a pit? Let him starve to death. That way we wouldn't actually kill him. Seems like they was still the same. Anyway, we justify things, don't we? Yeah, that's what was happening. The others agreed to the plan. And reading the story, we see how evil the plan was. But to Joseph's brothers, the plan didn't seem all that bad because they had spent their lives working their way up to worse and worse things. A little jump is not a big deal, and that's all they were making was a little jump into something that was worse. They managed to justify what they were doing as not really so bad because they had learned how to cauterize their conscience. That is possible, you know. It is possible to silence our conscience so much that we can actually, in a situation, even tell ourselves that God would even approve if I disobey him just this one time. Because I really need it just this one time, I'll go ahead and steal. Or just this one time, because I might lose my job, I'll go ahead and work on Sabbath. I'll skip returning my tithe just this one time because I can't meet the bills this month. But that's not the way loyalty works, is it? Loyalty is not the slave of convenience. Loyalty is not even the slave of necessity, is it? It's only loyalty if it's loyalty all the time. And the wonderful thing about loyalty to an all-powerful God is that He never lets us down. His power is the most obvious when we have no power ourselves. His power is the most obvious when we have no other options than to depend on Him. I'm just finished a book called God's Smuggler. If you haven't read it, read it. It's great. About how miracle after miracle God came through. And to just make it all that more obvious, as this man was smuggling Bibles into behind the Iron Curtain, he took to saying, God, there is no way that I can get through this without my Bibles being found. And so therefore, to just make it all that more obvious to myself, I'm putting the Bibles on the passenger seat beside me. He's still alive. And he got all the Bibles in over and over and over again. Not just once, but hundreds of times. They said the KGB, it was the book God's Smuggler, was required reading material for them. And he asked a KGB agent later, because he tried to give him a book after the Iron Curtain fell. And the guy said, don't worry about it, I've read it. And they said, why couldn't they stop him? And he said, they couldn't. It wasn't an option. They couldn't. God says, obey me no matter what, and I promise that I will work out everything for good. And when God promises, that promise is sure. Does that mean that He's going to work things out exactly the way that we expect Him to? Does that mean that He's going to work things out the way that we want Him to? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I guarantee you that when we are able to look back on our lives someday, we won't change anything of the way that God led us. The only things we will wish we could have changed were the times that we chose to be disloyal. When Joseph arrived, instead of welcoming him, his brothers ripped off his robe, and while their little brother was crying and pleading with them, they threw him into a pit. Then they covered his robe in blood and perfected their lie. After throwing Joseph into the pit, Joseph's brothers sat down to eat. And the Bible doesn't describe how the meal went, but my guess is it wasn't a joyful, happy meal like they had intended. My guess is that they were not as happy as they had been with their revenge. Many of us have discovered the same thing for ourselves. The feeling of satisfaction that they had expected from their revenge never materialized. After revenge, an empty, unsatisfied feeling comes instead. And Joseph's brothers, I imagine, chewed their bread in silence without much appetite. Guilt filled them. Reuben finally left to go off and check on the flocks. And eventually, the brothers saw in the distance the dust made by an Ishmaelite caravan. Look over there, says Judah. You know what that is? Probably a merchant caravan. I think so, said Judah, and it gives me an idea. What do we gain by letting Joseph die? After all, he is our brother. What do you think of this idea? What if we sell him to the Midianites? That way we won't kill him, and we'll get a little spending money for a party in Dothan. And so the brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit. And I imagine Joseph being extremely relieved that his brother's little practical joke was finally over, until he figured out what indeed was happening as they bargained back and forth to sell their brother into slavery. Have you ever tried to put yourself in Joseph's place? I mean, as though it was you standing there, your brothers selling you into slavery, into a group of people that you didn't know, a language you didn't know, a future you didn't know? Can you even manage to not really? At times like this, the question people ask is, where is God? If God is stronger than the devil, why is this happening? Where is he when I need him the most? I thought the Bible said that all things work out together for good for those who love God. This is not good. There's nothing good in it. Why do bad things happen to good people? The answer to that question is both simple and it's complicated. And it's not even always satisfactory when you're in the middle of it. But the reason is a good reason. Bad things happen to good people because God is letting Satan work. From our human perspective, we might have a hard time seeing why God would allow this, but there is a good reason. We have plenty of hints in the Bible as to what that reason is. One gets the feeling that Satan has leveled some pretty tough accusations against God. One of which is that God's system of government restricts personal freedom. And evidently, Satan was convincing enough that he was able to take with him a third of the population of heaven. The angels that joined him easily number into the billions. And among those that remained, among those that did not go with Satan, there must have been many questions that needed to be answered. Someone once asked, why didn't God just take the devil for a long walk and not come back? But if God had done that, how many would want to go on a long walk with God after that? Right? If God had made Satan simply disappear, there would always be this nagging question in the minds of God's creatures whether or not God could actually be trusted. Whatever happened? In order to forever lay such questions to rest, not just now, but for the rest of eternity, God allowed Satan for a limited time to make his case. But at the cross, Satan's case was completely destroyed. When the Son of God came and voluntarily exchanged his life for ours. Satan lost the battle with God then and there, and now Satan is using whatever is left of his time to inflict as much suffering as he possibly can, because as Revelation 12:12 says, he is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. Therefore, during this one short time that the devil is allowed to work, God does not entirely protect us from the suffering around us. He does protect us a lot more than we know. He does protect us a lot more than we may give him credit for. But of one thing we can be sure: God is never responsible for evil. God never ever does something wicked in order to accomplish something good. I once attended a funeral where a well-meaning person said to a husband who had just lost his wife, it was God's will. I wanted to shake her and say, no, it wasn't God's will. That's why God sent his son Jesus to conquer this thing called death. God has unlimited ways to accomplish his will without the help of evil. But wait a minute, didn't God want Joseph in Egypt? Yes, he did. But he didn't need the Midianite traders for that. He didn't need Joseph's brothers for that. He just told Abraham, go, and Abraham went. Maybe Joseph would have done the same thing. But Satan got in the way. And God had to adjust his plans. And that's something that's incredible about God. While he doesn't need evil to accomplish good, he is fully capable of taking evil and turning it into something good. The thing to remember is that God doesn't force our decisions. He doesn't force our choices, which means that some things happen that God would rather didn't happen. And so therefore God switches to another plan, but he's a master at flexibility, and his ultimate purposes will succeed no matter who or what gets in the way. I've used this illustration before. I don't know if it's here or not, but a little parable of a master painter who is going to paint his masterpiece in front of an audience. And so he goes to a big arena and people are seated around, and he begins to paint his giant canvas, and the crowd oohs and ahs because of the beautiful thing that's taking place in front of them. And when he's done, he stands back and the crowd gives him a standing ovation. They've never seen anything like it. But then from the crowd jumps a man with a bucket of black paint and a wide brush. And he runs down into the arena to the canvas and puts the nasty black slash across the beautiful painting, and the crowd gasps. And the security guards at the edges come running in, but for some reason that the crowd does not comprehend, the painter waves them off. No, leave him alone. And he goes over to that black spot, and with a flourish of his brush, he makes it into something that wasn't there before. And the crowd goes, "Oh!" And the man with the black paint comes and he does it somewhere else. And then he goes somewhere else until he makes a whole mess. And right behind him comes the master painter. And he turns it into something else every single time. And finally, he waves in the security guards. All right, take him away. And the arena is silent, in absolute awe at what is now before them on the canvas. Something that had never even been intended, something that had never even imagined, something that couldn't have been, now stands before them. That's what Jesus does with evil. Naturally, Joseph was afraid. And for a while on his journey, he gave himself up to grief and terror. I mean, who wouldn't? The way Joseph's father had treated him hadn't prepared him for this. Being the preferred son, constant tenderness, indulgence, those things hadn't helped Joseph's character. Joseph was a good person, but in some ways it was in spite of his father. Years of this pampered treatment had left Joseph unprepared for the difficulties and the trials that he was going to face. And while on that trip, Joseph came to realize that his life was never going to be the same. And in the few days that it took them to reach Egypt, Joseph learned some lessons, and Joseph made some decisions that would have taken him years to have learned at home with his father. Fear makes a person feel inadequate, too small for a situation. But that day, Joseph chose to believe that God was big, bigger than his situation. Joseph could have given up on God, considering the situation that he was in. Happens all the time. But instead he made a conscious decision that God would carry him through. God didn't stop the bad thing from happening. The bad thing happened. But when Joseph chose to trust God anyway, God used that experience to prepare Joseph for something he was going to need in the future. Faith doesn't save us from the fire. Faith sees us through it. God was able to use Joseph's fear to strengthen his trust for the future. God knew that Joseph was going to need that strength in some of the things that he was going to face later. A time must come in everyone's life when we are completely helpless. And at that time, we have to choose whether to turn to God or to turn away from God, blaming Him for not stopping what happened. If we choose to rely on God, He promises that He will use that situation for good. Joseph didn't see how this was good. Joseph didn't see how it could ever be good. On the way to Egypt, Joseph began to recall the promises. He began to recall the stories of how God had protected others and turned bad into good for them. And he found hope and he found comfort in these promises. And he resolved to trust God to care for him. His heart even thrilled at the thought of proving himself faithful to God no matter what situation he would encounter. And what a difference that decision made in Joseph's life right then, but for the rest of his life as well. Joseph had a heartbreaking crash course in trusting God by passing through a life-shattering experience. And that's what it was. It was a life-shattering experience. And in the end, he passed that test with top honors. Someday in the earth made new, Joseph will be honored and he will be rewarded for the way that he responded to suffering. And so will we. We will be honored and we will be rewarded if we stand firm and trust in our God no matter what. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purposes. That's a promise, and you can take it to the bank. Amen.